Okay, all right. Social contagion. So I've started this section, and I'm going to be talking about simple models, right? And so again, this story for understanding systems that are, which we don't sort of have fundamental equations for necessarily. There's a lot of work that can be done, very good work in setting up simple models and just kind of exploring what can happen with them, right? So there's some simple heuristics that go into them. So for the biological contagion, we have this very basic idea of probability of infection, probability of recovery, and from that we get that phase transition story. And that's it, right? So that's the bedrock idea there, and we've seen how moving away from that gives you some vastly different behaviors, right? So this kind of whole resurgence thing and more realistic ones, so you don't have to go too far. So it's often the case with models that you move them in different directions, horrible things happen. So this is just part of the game. You have to understand these things. There's been work in social contagion in the last 4 or 5 years where people have started to really look at data, right? So that's been sitting there as a big, big problem for a long time. Lots of talk about these heuristic models. Again, what I'll focus on. So here's a little bit. So I showed you Duncan Watts' shoes. So Duncan is now at, he was at Yahoo, that fabulous company, Yahoo. And then they went through one of their usual sort of conniptions and research disappeared. So Microsoft, well, everyone in principle could have gone anywhere. And there are some really big names in these groups doing good stuff. Yahoo had a very, true research kind of outfit. So Microsoft, they actually kind of went in a bit of a package deal to Microsoft. So they're all still in New York City. This is Jake Hoffman, who works with Duncan. He is a product of Columbia University. And so he has this little piece. So this is about influence, right? So they're trying to measure how things spread, and this is on Twitter. This is just, and others have done similar things, but I'll just show you. Hopefully this will work, and you guys can watch this. It's just a few minutes. It's Microsoft. Okay?
Hi, my name is Jake Hoffman, and I'm a computational social scientist at Microsoft Research. And today I'm going to tell you about viral search. Viral search is a new means of navigating, searching, and exploring content that spreads over social media. We've gone through hundreds of thousands of stories that are recently posted on Twitter, looked at billions of mentions of these stories, and reconstructed trees of how these things pass from one individual to a next. So here's an example of a story by Forbes, which is about Jeremy Lin. And what we can see here is that the story initially started with Forbes, that has about 1 million followers, and then direct people who were following Forbes reposted that story. And most of those posts didn't go any further. Here's an example that went 1 generation further. And then most of the adoptions have stopped by then, and we've got a total of about 150 people posting this story. So this is sort of traditional broadcast style media where we have a big outlet posting to people who directly consume it, and then it doesn't really go much further. In contrast to that, here's an example of sort of a viral video, a cover of a Gautier song. And so this is what people sort of typically have in their mind when they think about one of these viral videos, but nobody's really been able to actually look at the structure of these things to date. And so what we're able to do is, going through these billions of events, we reconstruct these trees by looking at all the followers of everyone who adopts the content and using a large cluster to reconstruct these things, and then a novel scoring method to actually distinguish this tree as being viral from just being popular. We can also look at all the independent trees in this story that were started by different people. So here's the version of the story we just looked at, which is started by the people who made the video that got 4,600 adoptions, but there were many other introductions of this piece of content independent from this story. And so we can see some of these get thousands of adoptions, and some get hundreds, and some get only dozens. We can also use viral search to look at contributions from particular individuals. So here's posts from Tim O'Reilly over the past year of popular news, video, and images. We can see he's quite prolific. And so the larger circles here represent more popular stories. The shading represents the number of generations these stories have gone through. So here's an example of a story that he was involved in relatively early on, as indicated by the concentric circle, that this went on for many generations and it became quite popular. We have another example of a less popular story. This reached about 500 people, and as indicated by the circle here, he was relatively late in posting this story. So that's viral search, which is a tool that lets you search and navigate cascades of people passing content on social media and distinguish between things that have not just become popular, but have also become viral in the sense that they've been passed on from one person to the next over many generations. Thanks.
So there's a lot of hard work that goes into these things, and I don't know if that's entirely online yet, but that's in the great tradition of Microsoft, you know, and IBM and so on, right? I mean, IBM had basically the idea of Google, right, for example, in 1998. It was John Kleinberg was working for them and said, hey, I've got this hubs and authorities thing, and they said, you know, so they put it into a box and wheeled it into a big warehouse and put a stamp on it, you know, kind of. You guys know that. Come on. Yeah, all right. So, and said, yeah, maybe we can license that. Okay. Anyway, the extra thing I want to say, because Jake is a great guy. He's a super guy. So there are a bunch of, you know, how big is the monitor, right? Because now we're into YouTube comments, right? Very dangerous, very dangerous space. But there's some good stuff down here. You are smoking hot and have a wonderful voice, Microsoft guy. Please make more videos. And I'm going to share this with him. Yeah. Hi, you're hot and smart. Engineers are the best. Very interesting and so handsome. Yes. So he's got to be the Carl Sagan of computational social science. Yes. Jake Hoffman. He was married, people. All right, so anyway, that was enjoyable to see. It can go horribly wrong, obviously, in YouTube comments, but kind of went pretty well for him there. So there's some other things. How big is the monitor? Okay, so, all right. So yeah, and I'll mention a couple of other empirical pieces that have been carried out, and certainly they've done some other work, and I could point to that. And I guess I will as I iterate this whole thing, but yeah, it's still a bit of a game. I mean, you have work going back into the 60s looking at, there's this famous work, Coleman and co, looking at farmers copying each other, actually, and usage of how they dealt with corn and so on. I think that's the story. So, hard fought for sort of data sets back in the day. And, Twitter's not everything. All these other data sets are not everything, but they definitely give us a lot more. They allow us, for one thing, to look at the failures, right? So that's a big problem with us. We tend to see the successes. That's what you see, right? That's why everyone thinks they can write a great book, because look at these great books, and they're just humans. And, you don't see the hundreds of thousands of terrible ideas that never, made it to maybe one scribble on a page, or someone had a vague idea about a book. They're not in front of you. You don't see all those, these terrible ideas that kind of litter the human landscape. You see the ones that win, so you get a false idea of things. But, maybe say in sports or something, we have a better idea of the whole story, right? But, okay, so we get to see the failures. The tweets that no one retweeted. There are a lot of tweets that don't get retweeted, right? It's just like there are a lot of papers that never get cited. So we can see those failures in these systems. Okay, so I've mentioned this kind of intro. I went through a bit of this intro the other day. All right, and BuzzFeed, we had a little bit of BuzzFeed, cute things, interesting things spread. We had the whole shoes business. And here it is. And yeah, right. So I want to get into just some simple models, right? So let's, that are quite strong departures from biological contagion. That's a hedgehog. Okay, so lots of things spread when we get to social, right? We have lots of horrible, fantastic diseases that spread. We're pretty excited about those. And you have to get into the details of exactly how these things work and solve those problems somewhat individually. But we have all sorts of stuff, right? So I think I mentioned this, Rubik's Cube. So I was in grade 6 when that one took off. It's very exciting. That's an interesting one to spread, right? Because most people couldn't do it, but it was still really fun, right? So it had this sort of many layers of interest to it. It's just it did quite well. Anyway, so lots of things spread. Leaving lectures, I always put that in for my amusement. So there have been some recent things that are more empirical. This is actually cessation of smoking. That's the link there. And obesity, right? So I'll mention those. Spreading through social contacts, right? So that's a big story. That has a lot of policy implications. I mean, sort of immediate application is don't talk to your friends who are large, right? So that's basically the upshot which people have, and I'm not just saying that to be, people have written that down. Okay, all right. Not very good. So there's a kind of this hallmark, this kind of SIR type contagion, right? So you're susceptible, you become infected, and you might recover, right? You join a cult. You join a cult, and then you leave the cult. You write a book about it. And then maybe you join another cult, right? So that's the SIRS, right? So that's the ability to go back and forth. So we have that possibility here as well. Smoking, of course, you could give it up, start again. Lots of things. Oh, yeah, right. So I was wandering around New York City when iPods took off. That was fun. Because suddenly everyone had white, right? That was quite distinct. You know, Sony used to have yellow, so you could see the Sony ones, and then white for iPods, which made mugging pretty easy, actually, right? So that sort of, yeah, so people started to use different headphones for a while. Yeah, society evolving. Oh, dieting is another good example here too, right? So you move on to the next diet, you stop it, you know. That's an SIRS type situation. All right, so there are lots of things. So, you know, countries falling apart, all sorts of things. You know, so it goes from simple to, you know, small scale to very, very large, and seemingly irrelevant to very, 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 very important. Language, of course, is the great spreading thing. Okay, so I want to talk about this a little bit. So Christakis and Fowler, it's very well-cited work. So Fowler's been on the Colbert Report, which is, you know, sort of the apex, right, of academic achievement. Christakis is at Harvard in the medical, sort of a sociologist in medical school. Fowler is at UCSD, I believe. He's a political scientist. So what they got hold of here, so it's an interesting data set. So, you know, Twitter and these things are obviously, you know, accessible now. This is a quite different source. It's the, and I do need to talk about it, it's the Framingham heart study, right? So it's a very famous medical study. So it's been going on for decades. And so you have people in families and their friends and so on, all being measured and measured again and again over, I'm not sure what the time scale is. I mean, obviously when there's problems, but also, you know, maybe every year they're getting checkups, and that all goes in this big longitudinal study. And it was basically, you know, to see how lifestyle and behavior and so on and all sorts of other things correlated with long-term health. Of course, you know, so it's been very successful in that perspective. So there was a funny thing sitting in that data set, which was, and this is not uncommon for these sort of social studies, which was just list some people you know who may be able to, if we lose track of you, we could contact them, and right, that'll be a way for us to find you again. So it was a sort of incidental little piece at the end, just sort of a little safety piece for the study. And so they noticed this and used that then as a proxy for, you know, some social information, right? So now you could, of course, you also had family as well, right? So there's family data in there as well. I think their story was to list one friend. Maybe people listed a few, more than one, right? So this a little bit of a funny data set in some ways. It does have, so I have to say, so it's been controversial, and well, let me show some more things. So the spread of spreading, which is obesity. That is my funny pun there. So getting, right, bigger. And that's supposed to be friends more than family or spouse, you know, like it's not, right? The biggest story there was supposedly friends, and they don't have to live right next to you. Happiness, they have that. They have loneliness, spreading, divorce, I think. It's all based on the same data set. There's a book. There's the Colbert appearance. Right? Well, I don't know. So it's you know, fair enough. I mean, this is the, you know, the surprising power of social networks. I think we've always known they were a big deal. We just haven't been able to quantify it as well. So lots of controversy. There was a New York Times piece that sort of dug into this. I'm pretty sure Duncan's quoted in this as well. You know, saying, well, we're not really sure, right? So this is a strong statement. It's really what people were taking away from it, of course. It's the direct statement. But it turns out that the data set is a little funny. So here's the obvious problem, right? So if you're listing, you've got all of these friends, you've got hundreds of friends, right? And you're only listing a few of them. So you can definitely show that they're strong ties. So there's something about it. But you know, maybe these guys are friends as well, right? So these two list each other, and these two list each other. So there's a reciprocation, but you could be friends with them as well, right? But if that's not in the data set, just because you're taking a very sparse sampling of this network, you end up with some funny possibilities, right? So it could be that these two like each other a lot, but if you don't have any of these, this person now seems to be 3 steps away. So that's tough. I mean, it's just a really hard thing to, networks are just really hard to deal with. Basically, no one contends with this problem. And I've mentioned a little bit. We've had, there have been pieces over the years. Georgi Kosinets at Columbia did some really nice work on this. Missing, what happens if you have missing data, missing links? Very difficult problem. So, but there's a very immediate one that could pop up. People who seem to be, or things or whatever they are, seem to be 3 steps away, or 4 steps away, or 5 steps away, could be much closer. And if anything, are closer, fair enough. So your idea of the effects, so one of the effects they have, for example, is this person getting a raise makes this person happier, or right, that kind of effect. So being 3 steps away has impact on you. Now, so we know this, I'm just going to say these things, we know this about social networks, right? That 3 steps away in various other measures, that's really the edge of your social universe, right? You know your friends, and you know something about your friends, and there's some impact through there. You can look at, say, what's the chance of you becoming friends with this person, or this person, or this person, without intermediate connections, right? So so this is good because you see them being introduced. This, you'd need to somehow, maybe you go to a party and these guys are friends, but you don't make these connections, you make this connection. So you see it gets to be a little harder, right? There needs to be more of some other context being involved. It's less of a social possibility. So 3 steps away. This is, right? This is, Voyager is out here going beep, 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 beep. This is, I don't know why I said that. This is the end of the solar system for you. And of course, right, these things evolve, they're dynamic. This person might gradually move through this network towards you. You meet random people now and then. But this is, yeah, so there's some quantifying work that's been done, in all of this to try and quantify the effects of things. Really hard because of this missing data problem. I mean, it remains. This is all, we understand there's a lot of influence, so hard. So this is another piece. There are various arguments back and forth about this. So, for example, height and acne and so on also spread amongst teenagers. If you look at certain data sets, which is not the data set they looked at, if you look at some data sets, right, health data sets on teenagers, height is contagious. It depends how you measure these things, right? So you can, yeah, so, and so they'll say, well, we didn't measure it like that, fair enough. So there's a bit of a fight, basically, is what's going on, possibly within themselves as well. All right, so tricky, right? Maybe it is. All right, I don't know. Deep sleep. All right. I don't know what happened on that one. I do need to highlight them. I mean, it's very serious work. They're really trying to get at these things. We're all trying to do it. But it's very, very hard. And it is this missing link kind of story that's hard, or not being able to quantify the network properly. Twitter gives you some hope of doing that, but again, it's a sparse representation of real interactions. Let's see. So we're going to look at this in 2 ways. So one is media influence, right? So there's widespread. So there's sort of idea of saturation. The stories are coming out from the media, and then word of mouth influence, and that's the one that's really interesting, right? So this is the one we're going to be. So this is where the physicists get excited because they say, all right, that's an external field. Right, and this is just interactions between local spin systems, whatever, right? So that's, I know all about this, yeah? Okay. Now that should I do this? I was abusing physicists, so I put a little Easter egg in this other one. I think I can find it. Oh yeah, right, there you go. So this was the page that had the, yes, of course you do the different thing. So there you go. There's a little, if you click on this guy, it should give you the appropriate, should. It didn't, XKCD, there you go. All right, this is good. We need to have this one. Okay, so you're trying to predict the behavior of complicated system. Just model as a simple object and then add some secondary terms to account for some complications I just thought of. Easy, right? So why does your field need a whole journal anyway? And this is, liberal arts majors may be annoying sometimes, but there's nothing more obnoxious than a physicist first encountering a new subject. All right. And I'm one of these people. All right, so if you need some help with the math, let me know, but that should be enough to get you started. No, I don't need to read your thesis. I can imagine roughly what it says. Well played, Randall. Well played. Okay. Does he knock computer scientists enough? Ah, see, that's not right. That's not right. Mm-hmm. With their black boxes of evilness. What's that? Okay, yeah. There's one on Wolfram too. What happened with that? All right, we'll have to look at that one. That's an interesting issue. All right, so there you go. It's a little, yeah. All right, so we need to understand influence. This is incredibly hard. It's very hard to measure. There's a famous work, which I have down here. So, all right, so who influences? Who's doing it, right? Is it from the media? Is it from your friends? I mean, what order of things did this happen? Given that you've adopted a new behavior or you're using a new kind of language, a way of speaking, extremely, extremely hard to measure. And again, that's why people are excited about Twitter, especially advertisers and some crazy scientists. So what are the response functions, right? So the response function that we essentially had for biological contagion was that you get a hit in that simple model. You get a hit if if it's a success. Now you're infected and you have to start to recover, right? But if it doesn't infect you, you're just free and you walk on, and then you have another chance to be infected, right? So there's no memory in that system. It's memoryless. But you might think, and we'll look at the extreme opposite, is that you start to poll the people around you, maybe sequentially and so on, but you're taking in information from people around you, of course the media as well. So there are complications there. This is something we like, and I'll have a story about this, I think, as to why, but are there some super influential characters, right? Are there people you can point back to and say, right, that's why it spread? And obviously that's sort of really a media story. Oprah connects to lots of people. She says, buy this book, they'll buy this book. So Malcolm Gladwell's story, the connector, the tipping point. And I'll kind of have a summary. I have to go through some more stuff about voting and all sorts of things, but I'll have a little summary piece at the end of all of this that tries to bring everything together about this kind of idea of spreading and influentials and success. So Malcolm Gladwell, yeah, Tipping Point, incredibly successful book, really an influential book about influentials. Right, so that's true. So it's the idea of opinion leaders, of influentials, it's infectious. People like that one, right? So it comes from, you can go back to there's a book from 955, which I have if you want to look at it, or you should be able to get a copy easily. I'd say Katz and Lazarsfeld. And so they did a lot of in the field work, asking people why they bought this thing, why they saw this movie. Can you remember the sequence of event? Was it from looking at ads in papers and so on? So very thorough work, of course, at the time. And they talked about just how hard it was. So here's the story that they were dealing with to start with. And so this is the brutally named hypodermic model of influence, right? So you're all sitting at home on your couches, and the TV just goes whoink into your brains, right? And you think, I will buy a Snuggly, or whatever those things are. I have 5 at home. Okay, so what are they called? No? Aha, we know, right? Okay. Interesting, yeah. Yeah. So you buy one eventually. But the thing is, you're sitting at home, and here's your little TV. And this is sort of from the 30s, the idea of mass media, radio and so on, of course, was the story then. Just sending out signals and people going, oh yes, I will do that, right? So it's easy to model. it feels great if this is really the way things work. You have power over the masses. But that was the dominant story. And then Katz and Lazarsfeld said, well, it's much more complicated. And if you really look at what they wrote, they said, well, it's a big mess. It's a network. There are some people who are influential in this case, but not in this case. Fair enough, right? But the great desire for people who want to spend lots of money to make people buy things is that they can find those influentials, right? And then pay them lots of money to trick other people into doing the thing, right? Whatever it is, buying the bad thing. Okay. And they make these things very tasty as well, so that it will work. But they said, all right, well, it's much more complicated, but this is a little bit better. It's not quite like that. People certainly talk to people. Obviously, that's a big deal. It's hard to measure this, right? But it's hard to measure this. But we have some sense that there are some people who are more influential than others. So they propose this two-step model of influence. And so this is, again, it's 1955. This has really been a dominant story for half a century. And of course, it's true. Some people do have more influence. But this is really thinking about word of mouth, right? So media, narrow out to word of mouth. So these people are apparently just sitting around, and maybe they see some of the media, but these are the ones who, everyone's being bathed in media, but these are the ones who say, you should buy the Snuggie. Yeah, it's really great. I love my Snuggie. And these ones, debate about which color they should get, right? So that's what. That's always good. You want to get people down to 3 choices, right? So Apple does this very well, for example. And a lot of places do this. You go into a store and there are 3 or 4 choices of something, so you can put yourself in the right category, right? Too much choice is a bit of a disaster, unless you're a real connoisseur. But if you just sort of want one of these things, you kind of want a bicycle, and you want a bike. It has to have wheels on it. So you give them 3 choices. There's the cheap one, the one here, and that. So people can say, oh, I'm the one who spends money all the time. So take the top one. Or I don't want to be cheap, so I'll take that. So, right. But now your thinking is now about what's in front of you, right? If you just had one thing, you'd have to go and compare it to something else. But you can reduce the game to, right, all of your cognitive effort can go into, wow, this one or this one or this one. It's done, right? You'll buy something. It's just a question of which one. Very good. 3 choices, always good. All right, so at least 3, I'd say. So that was the plan, and that's gone on for a long time. So people make companies and all sorts of selling medical things, selling just general advertising, want to find these characters, the influentials. And there's just an enormous amount of literature, books written about this. Who are these people? What are their qualities? How do we find them? And it's all over the place, right? It depends. Sometimes people are influential in this category, and sometimes in other categories they're not. So how do you reliably find these people? Well, truth is it's much more complicated. And of course, you guys have never seen one of these things, but imagine, I don't know, a little smartphone or something. But there are, there's still media. So this represents kind of all media, whatever it is, Facebook and Twitter and all these things. But people, of course, talk to each other everywhere. So it's this much more complicated, hard to measure piece. So once again, perfect example where Katz and Lazarsfeld were clear that this was really the story. It's just very hard to measure. And so they said, well, let's have something in between that we can kind of get at and we could say something about. Then everyone forgets about this bigger part. And what you can measure becomes what's true or what's important or what's the dominant story, right? That's a thing that happens over and over again. Right? So we can measure money, so that becomes everything, for example. Numbers next to things. Very good. All right. So why do things spread? And I'll recapitulate this a few times. So is it because of these properties of these special individuals, right? These stars? Is it something about them? Is it something about the message that's more important, given the way the system works? And that sort of ties into this story. So is it something to do with the network as a whole, or the social system as a whole? And this is the first comment again. So is it the match, right? So if you have a fire spreading everywhere, do you go and find the match? Do you say that's the reason this thing took off? We tend to. And the reason is because we like to make stories, right? Again, I'll recapitulate this with some things later. But we are story-making machines. So then we can see the narrative, right? So here's the spark. They'll spread out from here. Let's go and get one more of those matches. Those matches are really good at lighting fires. That's how we light fires. And and I think that the forest example is pretty clear, right? We understand that quite well. It's because the place was dry and connected, and depending on the story, but the thing spread for pretty measurable reasons. And if we put in fire breaks or it was raining, for example, you've got your match, or it's not going to work. Okay, so, but we tend to do this a lot, especially for social phenomena. We'll go and find the match, right? This thing spread because here's the genius who kind of came up with it. Right, we like causality. So I'll have some more about this, but when we see something succeed, again, especially in social phenomena, it's very natural to ascribe its success to its intrinsic characteristics. Right, the social process that got it there is really hard to see, and we tend to just discount it. We can't see it, we just discount it. So the Mona Lisa is great because of the way it's painted, right? It's beautiful. The woman is beautiful. It's all these things that we've talked about, like why the great mystery of its. What is it that does to people's heads that makes it so great? And I'll have some more about that. So yes, so again, it's very hard to see the system, the group. It's incredibly hard to see this. We don't really even have good metaphors for it, right? We have great metaphors for individuals, right? So we like to see other groups as having a leader and then a bunch of minions, right? That's an easy thing to conceive. If there are a whole bunch that are kind of working together, that's a little scary, right? We do it all the time. Sports, we do it all the time. We always say, X and their team, which in some sports is completely reasonable, but others where the team is really, a functioning unit, it's just much easier to highlight that individual. It's better, because people can map themselves into an individual. You can't map yourself into a group. Some good stuff in Pratchett about that, right? Yeah. You can't borrow the mind of a hive of bees. Well, you can if you work very, very hard. So you want to see what people said beforehand, and so I have a couple of examples of that, right? Because afterwards, story just kicks in. Story making kicks in and says, well, this thing took off because they're... All right. So here's this painting. And actually, in real life, it's a bit bigger, but not much, right? So who's actually seen... Have you ever been there? So if you walk in, it's just, that's the thing that's striking to me, is it's like, oh, so little. And, but, by sort of knowing about it just generally, because, this is obviously the greatest painting ever made by a human, right? This is clearly, this is the best painting. You do it without thinking. Name the 10 greatest paintings ever by people. Not by elephants, they're good too, but by people. It's really probably hard for most people to get to 10, I would think. Probably pretty hard. If you're not, art is not your thing, maybe 3. So the Last Supper one was pretty good. This one with like war, cherubs, the Pollock stuff. I don't know. Okay, so yeah, that's funny. So let's see. So it's not the greatest world. It wasn't. It certainly, absolutely wasn't the greatest painting. It didn't. It didn't just say, "Look at this," and they're like, "Wow." Well, it did not happen like that. It didn't happen like that. It actually sat in the Louvre. I mean, they, knew it was pretty handy and did all these other things, like inventing hideous war machines every second thing, I suppose. But look, I have doodled right. Very dangerous human being. But I guess it's being paid. Let's see. So it did sit there, but people, would, of course, to learn this, the great ways of painting, one of the things is to go and paint, right? To sit in the gallery and copy, right? So, but this was not. You can look at it. This wasn't being copied in the 1800s, like Rembrandt's and so on. And it really takes off around the 1900s. It was stolen. There was some other things that happened. There was an act of vandalism, so it kind of got into the press and so on. And Leonardo's star was rising as well, based on all these hideous things that he made and other ingenious things, helicopters and things, right? Or at least doodled, He's the greatest napkin doodler ever. And submarines, yes. Here is one. Yeah, so everything was kind of lifting up, and You know, this is from a long time ago, but there are parodies. You know, it's once you get to parody, then you're really, you know, you're set, right? So that's good. There's this, and then there's this. There's parodies of parodies. So we just, you know, it's just so embedded as the greatest painting ever, right? So this book here, if you're really super interested, you can go into this. David Sassoon. It goes back and he does a very good job of tracing all of these things that happen to try and get at those social elements, right, of how it took off. And now it's stuck, right? This is sort of irremovably the greatest painting ever knocked out on a canvas. All right. Interesting. Okay. Come on, think. This is a pretty big deal, and you were probably born about the time this happened. So, or after it. Okay. Wow. So there was this whole thing in Europe where terrible things happened, and they didn't want to talk to each other, and they put a wall up, and it was very, very, very extremely bad. I mean, the history of human behavior, really awful. But that wall was there, and it was really stuck. It was just, you know, of course, people wanted to keep it up. Some people, and many, many people around the world would, you know, if they ever talked about it, it'd be great to see this thing come down, but it just seemed stuck. So suddenly, and very suddenly, over a period of a few years, all of this changes, right? I mean, we have the Cold War beforehand. It's a very stressful time for the world, and no one really predicted this. You'll see some people say, well, you know, any sufficiently complicated story, you know, someone will have said what happens to it later on, right? But you might want to look at the other things they said because they're probably totally bananas. But you know, but very few people could see how this could happen, right? So we'll get a glimpse again from these simple toy models of kind of how this could take off, because you did have a subpopulation that did want to see the thing come down. The work by Timo Karan is very important here. That actually, you know, gets some of the models. It invokes some of the models that I'll talk about, but it's very much a dynamical system story. It's very much a physics kind of story that, you know, you're near a phase transition in some sense. Nothing is happening. There's a fixed point of 0, which means, you know, no one is rioting or you know, revolting in the great way of humans, and then suddenly everyone is, right? I mean, it's hard to be the one who's done. I mean, right? It's hard to be the one who first comes out and makes a stand of some sort. But that's what happened slowly. There were these marches, and they kept growing. And you have to have something happen, right? You have to have the police not really put it down, or the state not put it down, which happened in Egypt. But it didn't happen in Bahrain and other places where, you know, the state, I mean, most recently, the state acted, right? So there has to be some other pieces. Prediction, right, is pretty bad. I've talked about this. So I think there were 13 editors that Rowling went to, and they all dismissed it. And the 13th or 14th one, I think their granddaughter looked at the books and thought it was really good. And that was the head of the, what's it called again? The English one? The English company. It was not a big company. Like something, forgotten. And said, okay, all right, we'll publish it. So that turned out pretty well. But there are many, many stories like this, right? I mean, this is common. I mean, obviously, editors do a pretty good job of getting rid of things that were just written on a napkin. You know, it's terrible things that someone's just typed their name a million times. You know, too much no-dose or whatever. Here's my great, you know, all work and no play, that sort of stuff. You get rid of that one straight away. Good. Yeah. So there was a Confederacy of Dunces, famous, you know, very famous English American story. But it's John Kennedy O'Toole committed suicide. He couldn't get it published, and he committed suicide. And his mother took up, you know, just utter disaster. And his mother took it around, and it took her a long time. Eventually, someone published it. You know, she was like, "You're going to publish, right?" And tried over and over, and then, you know, wins a Pulitzer Prize, and it's a great, considered a great. I think that's right. Yeah, obviously, yeah, posthumously, but I think it's, you know, it's considered a great piece. So, so it's not to say that. So it's more complicated, right? We'll have some of that later on. It's not to say. So here are, you know, all books and or movies or whatever they are, all that sort of ideas, and there's some ones that might do okay, right? This is a much bigger thing, and editors, sort of kind of floating around. I mean, they're rejecting these ones. Wow, this is the worst Venn diagram ever. But they're rejecting these ones. They're sorting those out. But this is a harder place to be in. Because it depends on the context as well, right? So if your book, Barry Snotter, comes out the day after Harry Potter, really disappointing. It's like going to be a 7-book thing about some kid going to a wizarding school in Scotland or something. And I don't know. That's really disappointing, right? So that happens too. So, all right. So I like talking about this. Okay, so social. So we get to this problem of we're kind of so we start to understand that we're not very good at this influence thing, understanding this influence story, and we start to understand that it's about people to some extent. I mean, people talking to each other. And obviously, Harry Potter's a great example. I mean, kids love it, and they talk to each other all about it. It has that social glue element. So then we start to do bad things, right? So we start to think, well, yes, it is these connections. So let's get in there and play with them, right? So maybe it's not this central individual, but it's all these connections that matter. It's how the thing gets passed around. So let's try and soup up those connections. So Google's looking at how people communicate with each other. Buzz Agent is maybe still around, but it's have you ever heard of this thing? Okay, so interesting. Sorry, it's maybe 2005 or 6. So the idea was you would receive, if you sign up for it, you would receive some samples of something, right, in the mail, whatever it is, and from some company, and some talking points. So you would go to your friends and tell them about this thing, whatever, at a barbecue or something, like just some kind of, whatever, and I said barbecue. So if you right, so you just, you're at a party, it's like, some sausages, whatever it is, right? You've got this thing, and you talk about it, but you don't tell them that you're shilling for a company. But they're trying to get out there in the social connections, right? So that kind of got into trouble a little bit, because eventually you find out your friend has, got this in the mail, and they're telling you about it and what's going on. And so they changed their plan a little bit so you would say things, but where it's come from. But actually, it happened to my wife. A friend of hers came around and had some stuff. And I said, where did you? And it was just a bit strange. And I said, where'd you get it from? And I kind of, and she, it was this Buzz Agent thing. It's like, whoa, that's not good. That is not good. Anyway, interesting. This is, of course, Facebook's doing this all the time, right? My God, Facebook. So the first thing they had was called Beacon, right? And they're trying to make money out of the humans with their talking to each other, and their photos and their sharing. Let's harvest that. Let's harvest social interactions. And Beacon was this idea, if you bought something, it got basically projected to everyone else. And that collapsed in a heap pretty early on, right? So do you actually remember this? Weren't you like 3 years old or something? No, okay. You do remember that? Okay. Yeah, and it was a disaster. It was So they've basically done it, and probably worse, but not used this word. And who knows what they're doing, because you can't tell, right? All right. So, all right, they're desperate to make money, of course. So all of Facebook's advertising. So that's a bit of a problem. I'm going to talk some more about this. This is fun. So this is a good book to read. Cialdini. So he's a professor, I think, at Arizona State University. Cialdini was one of the people on. Most recently, he was on Obama's team, actually, of 5 or 6 social scientists trying to help, get more people to vote, right? Which they work very hard at. So he's a very well-known guy. So he has this book, Influence, which it has pictures of things in it, but it's all full of citations. So it's a really interesting mix of a very readable book that's got tons of good stuff at the back as well, right? It's deep. It goes the whole way. So he talks about 6 modes of influence. He breaks it out into these 6 modes. So it's interesting. We'll get to a very simple kind of influence that we'll model, but here's what he puts out, and I think there's a chapter for each one. So reciprocation, and this has been through 4 or 5 editions. It's evolved a lot. So the idea, you give someone something in some way, then you own them a little bit, right? I mean, we're kind of good at knowing this if we think about it. It's like, yeah, no, don't worry. You pay me back some other time, right? But it happens just very, very, very simply. So free samples or something. Used to be that, and this is an example he uses. So Hare Krishna would be at airports, and they would give you a flower, right? Just very simple. It's all very, give you a flower, and then that's it, right? I bet it would mess with people really badly. They're like, God damn it, and they give you some money and they throw the flour in the rubbish and then they get the flour out. And, but it really elicits, it's just, these are sort of deep things that we have. It's not true for everyone. You may be sitting here laughing and going, fools, these soft humans that do things for others. But if you're an economist, for example, but why are they so weak? Okay, so also this, so this is number 2, commitment, right? So once we get going into something, we don't like to stop. So if you can, so hazing is a good example. So once you, right, religions do this as well, like right, we won't tell you about, God, I'm not even gonna mention it, but it's just a kind of a psychology test to start with, but we'll tell you about some of the other things, like the nuclear explosions in volcanoes and Zebu, the great god Zebu, yeah, that stuff, right? So, I'm dead. Okay, we'll tell you about that later on, right? We'll tell you about Deuteronomy later on as well. That's another good one. The thing about roosters and yeah. So, so once we get you in the door, Freemasons are good at this, but we do it all the time. Always funny, the Freemasons. Okay, so actually very popular where I came from. Let's see, so social proof, so that many other people are doing the same thing. Very, 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 very intense story for us, right? That suggests that, well, there are lots of reasons for this. I guess I'll say it again, but many other people doing it, you might get the idea that they've judged these things by themselves and they're using it or doing it because it's good, right? They're enjoying it for some reason. So you can't assess everything, so it's useful to have that, right? That there's a limit to what you can do, so that's very useful. Of course, they all could be copying each other, and we have little defenses against that. If your friend jumps off a cliff, are you going to do it? So your mother tells you, right? Would you do the, if your best friend jumps off a cliff, are you going to do that as well? My youngest one is a copying machine, which just terrifies me, just unbelievable. But that's what we are, right? We do it. Language, for example. Okay, so these are some bad examples, but Jonestown Massacre down in South America, you have several thousand people essentially commit suicide, right? Drinking the bad stuff, and there was a lot of stress and madness, and some people ran away and so on, but that's a crazy thing to happen. Again, these are examples from this book. So liking, very simple. Someone is nice to you and likes you and so on. This is, and they're expressing some similarity with you. That's hard, right? That's another thing that draws you in. Red hats and blue hats. You put people into different groups and they just, they spread apart. There's of course authority. I mentioned Milgram a few times and the obedience to authority experiment. And scarcity is the last point. So the idea that it's hard to get, right? So prohibition's a great example. That's very influential to people. They love it. So so in this book, many examples for all of these pieces that are there. And then he has this kind of finish to this. They're funny heuristics, but they're very helpful. When everyone's behaving okay, these are good things, right? You need some defenses against people behaving badly. Certainly they can be used and sort of used against you, and that's the problem, right? When advertisers do this all the time. It's very blunt usually, right? You see these 30-second spots where they're trying to get you to feel like the person in the spot is you, right? You can sort of see that. That happens a lot, and you're like, really, but it's clumsy and silly, but they're really trying to do that. Use one of those things out here. So, but the more they're leveraged, the more we can't use those heuristics. So that's problematic, right? That's where it goes really, really bad. All right. The one we'll use is really social proof, right? That's the thing. Everyone else is doing it. I'm going to do it. Lots of other things. I don't need to talk about this. Conspicuous destruction. Yeah. All right. That's fine. Okay. So models. So I want to talk about. Move you into these network models, which are extremely interesting. There's been a number of people work on these, but really it goes back to Schelling. So we talked about that in the opening lectures. This work on segregation, agent-based model, right? simulation on checkerboards. That's what he was doing. He just had coins, and he was getting them to move with simple rules. And this is the first kind of, I mean, people could talk about this, but this is the first that is a terrible word. It's the first time people, as I understand it, people really someone had put this idea of a threshold into a real functioning model. So in this case, it was, as you know, if the number of people around you were similar enough to you, you'd stay put, right? And if that exceeded some threshold, then you'd want to move. And with the big story coming out of that, the surprising story coming out of that was that with pretty reasonable thresholds, people didn't have to be kind of bad people in some sense locally. You would end up with global segregation. So, which when we tell a story about that, we think everyone's bad, right? Everyone must be bad for that to happen. But you can have a population of generally okay people where everything goes to bits. There's a net logo thing. If you want to play with that later on, you could mess around with that. We're not going to do it. So that's 71. So now you have Granovetter, who we've talked about with weak ties. Granovetter comes up with a model. The first paper is just with him, and then he has 3 other papers with Roland Sung about these models. So these are now, so this is some effort to have a social story, right? Because people are laid out in space, in this case. This is going to be one where actually everyone's watching everyone else. So you're looking at what everyone else is doing, and then you're going to make a decision. So if 50% of people are, behaving in a certain way, rioting, then you join in because your threshold is, say, 45%. Right? So people will have these thresholds. So it takes out the network story or the population structure story and moves it to what it focuses much more deeply on the threshold thing. Right? So Schelling had this idea of everyone having the same threshold, depending on their type. This is something where now we think, well, people have different. There's some spread of thresholds in the population. What does that give rise to? Right? So it will really matter. There isn't you can't think of the average person in this case, which sometimes you can do in, say, economic modeling, right? You take sort of the average person, and you say there's a bit of a spread around that, but it's okay. So, which can be fun. But in this case, we'll see that matters, and then we'll put it on a network, and then various kinds of networks, and see what happens. There are many other models. There's this whole area of herding models where people are doing actually quite rational things. They're not sort of just copying each other, but they're making, if someone chooses to adopt something, then you use sort of a statistical inference to say, this is the right thing to do is this or this. And so you can get these runaway cascades, so-called informational cascades. All right, that's a body of work that's given. That's really in the economics literature. That's a big piece. So that's actually, that's 92. All right, so thresholds. So let's talk about thresholds. Let's get this set up. Really, really complicated things can happen. And it took about, 7 or 8 years to solve the basics of the simplest model for the network story. All right, so as I said, so people will adopt a behavior that's just really, this is a situation where we think, and there's been very little work done on this. I can point to some later on. Well, this is going to be a case where you've got all the things you do, right? And then there's some new thing that you could do as well. So it's going to be a binary situation where you're not doing it or you are doing it, right? Not rioting or rioting. And there's all these other possible behaviors. So, so everyone has a threshold, and they're looking at some fraction of the population around them, and we'll start with that fraction being everyone. So that's this story. So it could be everyone in the population, some reference group, your network or whatever it is. There's some media that you look at plus your local network. You can certainly have probabilistic kind of responses or deterministic ones. So that's fair enough. We have this simple story of varying thresholds. And lots of assumptions in these models, of course, to start with, but you'll be able to see what they are. And so one of them is that it doesn't matter how other people adopt this behavior. You're always just polling everyone. Let's say you're looking at your 10 friends around you that you care about with respect to yo-yos or whatever it is, and you don't care if it's this one or this one or this one started. When you get to 6 yo-yo users, you're on the team, right? So, and of course, in the simplest models, we're going to look at network structure, which will help. But the influence that each person has over any other individual is the same. Obviously, you vary that. So this is something that could be flexed and varied and have some distribution. The idea is, well, let's let this guy vary as well, the thresholds first. Okay. Okay. Lots of unrealistic things. So we've talked about this a little bit, but this is the social proof story. There could be just that you want to coordinate with other people, right? Just very simple, kind of there's a little thing in your head, a little directive that says other people doing it, do it as well, right? I'm a human, I'm a social thing. So you don't even think about it, right? Totally rational. So, it's the lack of information story. I mentioned this. You can't quite figure the whole thing out, but if everyone has a blue car, then you might as well get a blue car. Must be good. Economics, we have this idea of network effects, right? So the fact that other people have, your 3 friends have iPhones. I mean, this is always try to be manufactured, right? So, somewhat, especially with technological things. So, you kind of want to build your thing to dominate, and no one else can communicate with it. That would be kind of nice, right? So those Macs can't invade the Windows story because there's no way they share. And that was, for example, with Mac and Windows, a very powerful thing, right? It was, well, everyone else I know uses Windows, so it's going to be bad for me to not be on that team, even though it's garbage. All right, so personal opinion. All right, so this, I will say, economics, not the best wordsmiths. So externalities, kind of what? So it's the right. So you're seeing there. There's some effect that occurs. Your 2 friends start using Windows. Maybe you never talk to them anymore, but it's hurting you, right? There's something is happening. They did it, right? And if you go back in the day, just the fact that people got telephones, right? Your friend has a telephone. This one has one. Fax machines, hilarious things, fax machines. It is pretty funny, right? That pretty much everywhere, your business cards, people have phone and fax. They still hang around a little bit. Institutionally, people do it. Because you can send things legally on faxes, but it sort of gets the same stamp. Phone is written in the same, and you often call a fax machine stuff. I mean, it's crazy. Why do we still have it? Anyway, all right. So somehow they will go away, and that's going to be the opposite story, right? These people don't have a fax machine. I guess this is not useful anymore. Right, it's going to evaporate out the other way. Telegraph, obviously, that happened. Yeah, your friends are all on Facebook, so you have to be on Facebook. And you can opt out. Opt out, it's hard. Your friends are on Twitter, whatever it is, right? So they shame you into joining. Yes, good. So basically, yeah, so people adopting things around you has an effect on you. All right, lots of different ideas. Okay, so let's finally get to a model. Lots of, sorry. Okay, you might not be able to see this, but this is a little function here. And the idea is that if someone, this is their response function to a particular thing, let's call it writing. And when they see 60% of the people they're looking at going outside and holding up placards, then they do it as well, right? And they're on. And they'll join the team. And if everyone has this kind of up threshold thing, but some different range here, then they all join in. Right? Once they join in, they don't leave because they've just added one more person. They've increased the fraction involved, so they won't drop out. Very crazy things happen if you have a response function like that, which is not unreasonable, right? So it could be if 90% of people are doing it, wearing Crocs or Uggs from Australia, and no one wears Uggs. Well, maybe they do, but it's not very cool to wear Uggs outside in Australia. So it's kind of it hurts a little bit here. They're kind of indoors, and yeah. If you're wearing them outside, you need a pack of cigarettes under your T-shirt and various other, yeah, that's kind of the, yeah. Okay, I said it. All right, so you can have that, where you start to see everyone has a pair of Uggs, I'm out of it, right? That's pretty reasonable. You could have a probabilistic thing. This is a bit funny. If you keep this response function, you want to have some memory here, right? So there's some chance you might adopt it given 40% are in or 50 and so on. And then once you're in, you have some resilience to leaving, right? You don't just sort of make this decision every time. That would be a bit weird. Okay. So we'll generally have, I think, I'll probably change notation a bit, but generally it should be phi as the fraction of contacts are on. And this is a two-state system, right? So you're either susceptible or you're infected, right? You're sitting at home on the couch drinking beer, or you're outside with the placards. Okay. And there's, people who have a flat line here. They're the beer drinkers, inveterate. They're not going outside. All right. Okay. And then some they're on, right? They're outside with placards, whatever's going on. That's fine. They've just got to, they just write a sign in the morning and go outside. So you're going to have, it's possible to have those, internally activated humans as well. So, you can put that into the model very nicely. All right, so Granovetter's model, very nice story. So we have the threshold of an individual. We'll have some distribution of those thresholds. Of course, we think of an infinite thing to start with, but we'll put it on a network. So an important thing will be the cumulative distribution. So we're going to just simply integrate from 0 up to phi star of this, distribution of thresholds. And if you think about what that is, well, it's right, so this cumulative f of phi star, right, so it's the fraction of population with a threshold, I guess I write this down, with a threshold, I don't know why I'm doing this, threshold less than or equal to phi star. So if the fraction of people is phi star, this is the, right? So if the fraction of people currently on is phi star, this is the fraction that will be on the next stage, because they're the ones whose thresholds are exceeded, right? So we get this story. So we can say the fraction that are on in the next time step, we'll think of its discrete time, which has all sorts of assumptions built into it too. It's going to be this. It's an update rule. So if you've done a little bit of chaos theory, dynamical systems, you're very excited about this possibility. So it's an iterative map, right? You just keep using this map. This thing is between 0 and 1. This thing is between 0 and 1. It's a cumulative distribution. So it tells you what happens in the next time step. So really with discrete time, what it's saying is, so you go home at night. Some people put their placards away, and some people, go home, right? Just didn't even come out. And then everyone knows what fraction of the population was rioting the day before. And then they all say, okay, they make their decisions based on this. They think about this. They compare their threshold to the fraction that were really activated. And then if it's exceeded, then they're out, right? So the next day they go in. So the next day they go out and riot. And then there's a new fraction, and that's observed, and then they do it again. So there's no coordination that's going on. I will say that I haven't been in a country where there's been uprising, but Robi Muhammad, who's one of our students at Columbia, who was a co-author on all of this work, the small world stuff, and the spreading stuff that we just talked about, biological spreading. So he was a student when there was an uprising against the Indonesian government. And so what happened to him was, other students are coming around, they've got a piece of paper and they've got all these names on it. I said, you want to add your name? Come out tomorrow. Bring your placard. It's a peaceful demonstration. So he adds his name and he turns up, and not as many people were, there was a little bit of adding some names, and it was definitely this social proof, kind of creating it a little bit. Early it grew. It became an enormous thing, and was, the world changed in Indonesia. But early on, it was pretty bad. I mean, there were people with guns, and he's like, because there weren't so many of them. So he got some. His idea of what the real threshold, or the real fraction rioting was maybe not representative of the truth. Anyway, so he made it through all that. Good guy. So very serious business, of course. so as I said, so this is a fraction of people who are writing at time t, and this is the story, right? So yeah, I guess you could write, yes. If you want to think of it like this. So what's the fraction of the next time step? Well, it's the fraction, you have to add up, you have to find the portion of the population whose threshold was between 0 and phi of t, because they're all exceeded, which is, of course, just the cumulative distribution. And in general, it is true that it would be minus f of 0 if you have a distribution that looks like this. There's some sort of, right, if f of t goes like this, so it's 1, 1, 0. So if this is f of t, for an example, f of phi, I should say. So the fact that there's a non-zero value here, to be a little subtle about this, means that these are the ones that just turn on straight away. Right? They're outside writing. So you have a little delta function in the distribution. All right, so iterative maps of the interval. Very exciting, very exciting. We can deal with those things. So let's have a look at a few basic examples. So again, susceptible, infected, 2 states. This is that same, what we're going to think about now. I talked about different response functions, but let's just take response functions that are deterministic. Right, so every individual has some threshold above which they turn on. Let's consider this then. There's a distribution of these switching thresholds. And in this case, it's some normal distribution, normal-like distribution, centered at 0.5. This is a pretty benign kind of thing. There's no one who switches on easily. There's no one who wants to stay home all the time. They're kind of all in the middle about it, right? This is sort of a bit of a majority kind of story, right? So once you get above halfway, if the fraction on was, you can kind of see, right? So if the fraction was above a half, then in the next time step, more than half of them would be on, right? And then you want to see if that grows. So in fact, this is a critical mass type model. So what you do, if you haven't seen these things, and if you've been in chaos, you will have seen these things. So here's f, the distribution of thresholds. Here's the cumulative distribution, right? So you're just integrating this thing. You draw it out, okay? Yeah? So these are cobweb diagrams. So you put in the y equals x line, and then you take your initial condition, and you map it to the cumulative in this case. And then, so this is your phi of t, this is your phi of t plus 1. So all right, so you go over here and find out what it is, and then you go back over here. But an easy way to do that is actually just to bounce off the y equals x line, because that's the new starting point, right? So then you bounce off that guy, and then so you make these little cobwebs. So you can see what's going to happen here. Because this derivative is greater than 1 at this fixed point, it's going to take off, and eventually everyone is on board here, right? If you start with less than half, so there's an exogenous thing, there's some way that the system starts, right? This through education or paying people to get involved to start with. There has to be some spark to it, right? So if you start with, in this, this very made-up example, if you start with less than half the population going, then it will, through time, pretty quickly evaporate, right? People will start to see that, their thresholds are not being exceeded when they really go and when they go outside and look, and it will peter out. So that's a critical mass model. It's a very simple idea of a critical mass model. You need at least half of the people in the game. You need the perception at least that half of the people are involved to start with. So you can start to see how one might explain these kind of takeoffs from very small amounts. You need to have, there's no way a small seed takes off. It's pretty bad, right? But if this distribution is moving, right, this starts to move gradually, and this slope on this guy starts to go up and eventually crosses 1. That's when you get takeoff from this fixed point, right? So there are 3 fixed points in this system. If you start with 0, you stay there. If you start with 1, you stay there. And if you start with a half, just the way it's set up, half of the people have a threshold greater than a half, and half of them have less than a half, so it works perfectly, right? They're all happy, so it's stuck. But that's an unstable fixed point. If you're near it, you move away. These two are stable. If it just went splat at the end, that would be kind of good. But, you know, that's a long way down. Wow, poor guy. OK, so if this goes up above 1, then you have an unstable fixed point at 0. And that's when the whole thing can explode. So that's why you can get this. You know, so that gives, I mean, it doesn't explain the fall of Eastern Europe, but it does at least give you some insight into why this very sudden change can occur. And there's all sorts of explorations of this. OK, so this guy, the mapping would go down this way and go to 0. But if we start just here, this one, it's taking off. Right? So if the population moves such that you get that derivative of the cumulative at 0 to be greater than 1, then you have takeoff. All right? So that's the main insight for social science, just starting off with this. And of course, we'll explore the models in more complicated ways. So here's another example. It's another critical mass, so it's a bit of a funny-looking thing. But you can see this is getting at this dangerousness of, I mean, that's a benign-looking distribution. It's not so bad, right? I mean, OK. I mean, there's some variation. There's some people are pretty happy, get excited about getting into this thing. You can see how a little more shift of that mass to the left will pop this up. And then suddenly, you know, it depends where that second fixed point is. If this actually moves up like this and there's no fixed point between 0 and 1, the whole thing explodes, right? Because it will go all the way up. Right? So if that went and lifted like that, exciting. So you can imagine what happens is as you move this distribution, this fixed point moves down here and then eventually merges this with this one and goes, and mathematically it kind of goes past it. Yeah. And again, very, you know, right, if you start just, you know, you've done a good job advertising your movie and you're hoping word of mouth helps later on, but you only got this in the door, this number in the door to start with, then, and people only care about the number of people who went to it, then, and for some reason they keep going back to the movie. OK, so it's not the right, it's not the same thing. OK, good. Rioting is good. All right. Back to rioting. All right. And here's a very different distribution. Now you have the, yes, we'll do it. This is great. Placards. Give me a placard. And this one is, you know, and then these ones are, I don't want to do this. So you integrate this guy, you get a very different looking thing. Right? So it's going to have 3 fixed points again, unstable in the middle and stable at 0 and 1. But it's above the y equals x line here and then drops off. So in fact, if you start with it pretty high up, anywhere short of 1, actually some of these resilient folk will start to realize that, you know, they don't want to be involved, and it drops away. But if you start anywhere down here, anywhere in this range, your fixed point that you reach is up here. So that's a, you know, it's a single stable. There's only one stable state in this story. All right, so here's a little summary for this guy. Basically, you know, we've seen this with Schelling. If you see collective uniformity, it does not at all imply individuals. I mean, it's just that's the easiest thing to say, because you say, all right, those people are all doing a thing, so all of them are the same, and they do that thing, right? But the way they got there could be through this kind of cumulative copying and so on. And then this extra really, you know, big deal, right? Things can break, okay? We've talked about phase transitions, but this is looking at it for social phenomena. You know, small change in the distribution, and then suddenly, you know, smoking is uncool, right? I mean, there's policy and so on. But, you know, like it's possible to do it. All right. OK, it's time for me to stop.